Hi, Michael. How are you?
Good, how are you?
Very
Good
good. Thanks for
to
joining
have your
us.
faces.
Yeah, you should see some familiar faces and some new faces. Everyone, this is Michael David Lukas. And I was just telling them before you joined how I was in a seminar that you gave. I attended a seminar you gave a few years ago at the Mendocino Coast Writers Conference about starting novels and how you should start. And I thought that that might be what we could talk about today.
Yeah.
Okay, well, so the first thing is I actually could not find my notes from that seminar, but I remember you had like a really great list of
Oh, yeah.
basic ways to
Um,
start.
yeah. So the idea for that seminar, which I was trying to remember whether I had taught at Mendocino. I guess I did. I've taught it elsewhere too. Comes from this, problem that I had trying to figure out how to begin my second book. For whatever reason, with my first book, I just kind of like had the beginning, I stuck with it, I liked it, and I never changed it. But for the second one, it was, one of these situations where I just couldn't find something that worked. And, I was sort of stuck on this one idea, and I was trying to find a way into this one way of doing it. And I just, who knows how many hours I spent working on this beginning that I ultimately scrapped. And so I was, weirdly enough, doing a writing residency in like kind of Tuscan castle sort of situation. And so the internet wasn't very good. And I remember like late one night, which was like the only time I could get the internet to work, like sneaking into like the main house where the this woman was actually a baroness who ran it, where the baroness slept, or where we weren't supposed to go, and like getting on the internet there and trying frantically to like search for a any sort of craft article about beginnings. And what I landed on was this really great piece by the writer Anne Hood. I'm not exactly, it may just be called Beginnings. And it's from Tin House Writers Conference, put out a series of craft essays called The Writer's Notebook, I think. And
Mm-hmm.
there's two parts to it. And so I forget which one her essay comes from. But basically, what she says is there's 10 ways of beginning a novel or a story, but she's really talking about novels. And she kind of sets out this, taxonomy of beginnings. And she says there's the introduction where the character introduces himself. There's the old saw, it was a dark and stormy night, whatever, a long, long time ago in a land far away. There's character description, setting description, en media res, which means in the middle of the action, facts, a truism or idea, like, uh, all happy families are alike, unhappy families are each unhappy in their own way. Dialogue, overture, which is kind of more of a tonal description, and other world, where we sort of immediately enter another world. And the description that, or the example she gives for that is the clocks striking 13, and I think it's 1984.
Mm-hmm.
When the clocks strike 13, you as soon as you read that, you're in a different world. Or Gregor Samsa waking up as a cockroach. And I like this taxonomy because it gives us sort of a way to talk about beginnings, which we don't necessarily otherwise have. But, it's limiting. And most good beginnings encompass at least 3 or 4 of those categories.
Mm-hmm. So when you found this when you found this essay or this article and this taxonomy, how did that help you? So how did that help you come to the beginning of your second novel?
um, now I'm trying to remember how. Okay, now I remember how I actually got. So it just allowed me to sort of pin down. Okay, what am I trying to do here? You know, and what I was trying to do was kind of a combination and media res and setting and character description. It was describing this main character. It was a whole scene that didn't end up being in the book, but it was describing this main character getting off the airplane, um, basically with a backpack, that had been packed by his father.
Mhm.
So there's that question they asked, are you carrying anything that anyone packed for you? And, he was. And he's a Egyptian American, half Muslim. And so I was trying to sort of get at some of this post 9/11 reality and what it means to be traveling to the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera. And I must have written that scene at least 100 times. And it just wasn't working, and it got to this point. And so it allowed me to see, like, okay, this is what I'm doing. I tried to write it in another way. I was like, okay, let me try to write it starting with a truism. Let me try to write it focusing more on setting description. Let me try to do like a little more en media res, like really be there in the action when we start out. Let me try to do a dialogue. It just gave me sort of a way of thinking about different ways to start it, which was helpful. But then ultimately, I realized that it just wasn't working. I tried it each of these 10 ways, probably 10 times each, and it just wasn't working. And so ultimately, it was one of these moments in writing where I was just like, I have to cut bait. I don't know if that's the right metaphor, but it sounds right. And I decided to scrap that and start with a beginning that I already had for a different section.
Mhm.
So there was the way that I kind of entered into this other section, which actually worked very well as a beginning to the whole novel. And that involved moving everything around and being like, okay, I'm going to actually start with this ancient timeline as opposed to the contemporary timeline. But, it was easier than making that beginning work.
Right. So actually, at this point, maybe it'll help because I know that actually quite a few of us have read your books, both your books, but some might not have. So before we get any further, can you read us the beginning of the Last Watchman, which is your second novel, so the one that you had problems with?
Yeah.
Um, and I was thinking to page 6 to the line before the line, the crowd grew ever more silent.
Oh, that's a lot. Okay. Yeah, sure. Okay. A long, long time ago, before Mubarak and the revolution, before Sadat and Begin, before Nasser, the free officers in the Suez crisis, before the Suez Canal, before Herzl, before Dreyfus, before Solomon Schechter in the Cambridge University Library, before Ismail Pasha and Muhammad Ali Pasha, before the British, the French, the Ottomans, the Mamluks, and the Ayyubids, before the Great Plague and Saladin, before Maimonides, the great sage, may his memory be a blessing. Our story begins before all this, in the reign of El Mustansir, when Cairo was still 2 cities and the Jews but a tribe among them. It was late summer in the 4800th year of creation, 4 centuries after Muhammad's migration to Medina, and more than 1,000 years after the birth of Jesus. The Nile had crested a few days earlier, and its entire shallow valley shone with damp brilliance. Beneath the purple silhouetted swoop of storks, the clang of an eager blacksmith mingled with the call to prayer and the smell of baking bread. That particular morning, there was another smell too, something sharp and unfamiliar at first. No one could put a name to it until, bleary-eyed and still warm from bed, they stepped into the day and saw that neat black thread of smoke rising from the Ibn Ezra synagogue. Before long, a crowd gathered in the courtyard of the synagogue. Women and children, dyers and glassblowers, pharmacists, money changers, and fishermen. For most, this was their first glimpse of the newly reconstructed synagogue, still unfinished, still unconsecrated by prayer, and already this beautiful new building was blackened by fire. It was a terrible thing, and yet it could have been worse. Apart from the smell of smoke in the prayer hall, the damage was limited to a shadow of soot beneath the scaffolding where the fire had started. Who would do such a thing? Some more hopeful members of the crowd thought they saw signs of an accident, a stray coal or a clumsy housewife. Others insisted that the fire would turn out to be the work of petty vandals. And then there were those who regarded it as something more sinister, a reminder and portent of things to come. Not that anyone needed reminding, for who could forget the reign of El-Hakim the Horrible? Who did not shiver to think of that sister-loving, false prophet who had destroyed nearly a dozen synagogues and churches, including the original Ibn Ezra? Who could forget that hateful despot who had gone so far as to outlaw malachia, the leafy green vegetable also known as Jew's mallow? He was gone now, El-Hakim, dead for nearly 20 years, and the current caliph, El-Mustansir, had proven himself to be a friend of the Jews. Still, one never knew. This discussion about the cause of the fire went on for some time, and all the while, Ali ibn al-Marwani was standing at the edge of the courtyard, waiting for the right moment to step forward. Fingering the sleeve of his robe, he tried to recall what he had been told to say, whom he was supposed to seek out. But in an effort to remember the directions to the synagogue, he had forgotten what he was supposed to do when he got there. Eventually, the crowd was beginning to disperse. As the crowd was beginning to disperse, someone noticed him. All at once, he felt the balance of attention shift. They were talking about him, an unfamiliar boy, thin cotton robe and cheap sandals, no older than 13. And as the murmur of insinuation collected to a boil, a circle formed around him. For a moment, Ali was alone in the middle of the courtyard. Then the young man stepped forward and grabbed him by the scruff of his robe. "Did you do this?" the young man demanded, forcing Ali's gaze towards the remnants of the fire. Ali opened his mouth, but he was not able to speak. "It is said that a thief returns to the scene of his crime," the young man continued. "Could not the same be said for our arsonist?" There was a buzz of agreement, followed by a few muttered calls for revenge. "Why does he not respond? Why did he not announce himself? What is his business with us?" The young man paused and looked out over the crowd as if expecting an answer. Instead, the silence was punctured by the sound of an older man clearing his throat. "Shamaria the Pious," someone said, and everyone stepped aside, making way for a hunched man with a mane of white hair tangled in his beard. When he got to the center of the circle, he addressed himself to the young man, who was still holding Ali by the scruff of his robe. "Amram," he said, "is it not written that we should judge everyone from his most favorable side?" "Yes, Father, but would you not—" "Release him," Shamaria the Pious said, then turned to Ali. He did not smile, but his eyes crinkled with compassion. "Tell us your business here, my child." There was a long silence before Ali could bring himself to speak. "I have a message from Abu Sa'd," he said finally.